In 1890, in the huge mountains of the Eight Ata, a random kid was born. But what people didn't know, that this child would change their lives forever. His name was Aso Obslam, and he grew up in a hard environment, literally an insanely harsh vertical mountain. The ground was frozen in the winter and flaming hot in the summer. He grew up learning the arts of hiding, climbing, and surviving. By his early teens, he had learned to use a rifle and travel long distances. By his late teens, he was focused on learning politics, laws, and leadership. In 1919, Aso Ubaslam became the leader of his tribe. At that very same time, France, one of the strongest nations on earth, had just emerged victorious from a world war. Their generals were experienced, their tactics were sharp, and their weapons were modern. Piece by piece, France took over nearly half of Morocco, finally arriving at the gates of the Ayit Ata. But the mountain tribes refused to bow. They decided to form a legendary alliance and face the enemy without fear. From across the peaks, the people spoke with one voice. They chose Ubaslam to be their leader. It's time for Ubslam's mastermind plan to work. He knew he couldn't beat them on flat terrain because the gap in soldiers and equipment was just too huge. However, he had a plan B. He knew that France would come to him in his mountain, so he sat there, gathered a small army, and began the greatest training arc. Everyone was doing their best, but the moment of reality finally came. 1933, Eight Ata Mountain. France had prepared over 80,000 soldiers with modern weapons and hard tactics. But before the 80,000 soldier push onto the mountains, the French had tried to send many smaller armies. Obslam had his tactics to stand, survive, and fight. He took advantage of the vertical mountains and cave chains. After every fight Obslam's men won, they took the equipment of the French military. Also, the women's and kids helped the heroes by managing supplies. After these humiliating losses, the 80,000 soldiers arrived and surrounded the mountain. Now we have 7,000 soldiers with old weapons and swords, led by Obslam, against 83,000 elite, well-trained soldiers led by professional leaders with modern equipment. So, how long do you think it took the French army to beat Obslam? 8 hours? 1 day? Or 2 days? No. The heroes of Ayit Ata were fighting like crazy. It took France 42 days of continuous fighting and bombarding from the ground and the sky. But how could Aso Obslam resist all of this? He and his people were ambushing the big army and then escaping fast. Not because they were scared, but because when the French soldiers saw them escaping, they would chase after them. And that was the plan. They led them straight into traps. The night attacks were also an amazing technique. French soldiers would be sleeping. Then suddenly Obslam and a bunch of his men would appear and finish the soldiers before disappearing. But despite all of that, the French army was so big, and they started using inhuman fighting styles. They began bombarding civilians, including women, kids, and old men. However, they didn't surrender. Everyone was suffering and fighting, so the French used a smart but devious move. They stopped food and supplies from reaching the mountain heroes. Many of the women and kids who moved supplies to the soldiers were captured and treated brutally. So, Obslam decided that it was time to surrender, but not in the way you think. It was a negotiation more than a surrender. France accepted very hard rules, so that in return, the fire would stop in Ayit Ata. The most important rule was not surrendering their weapons. Obslam was a genius. He knew that if he gave up his weapons, the French would finish him instantly. He also defended the people of his tribe, ensuring that no one from Ayit Ata should be treated like a slave. Finally, the French would not rule Ayit Ata. It would remain independent from France. At the moment of signing the agreement, Obslam and his people descended from the mountains with their weapons ready and their heads held high. There was no humiliation, only honor. They stood as heroes in the eyes of the very generals who had won a world war. But don't think for a second that France actually kept their word. They were a brutal colonial empire, and a piece of paper wasn't going to stop their greed. The moment Obslam and his heroes stepped off that mountain, the French plan of absolute betrayal began. They didn't leave Ayit Ata independent. Instead, they used a dirty divide and rule tactic. They forced Obslam to become a Quaid, a local chief working under French command. Not to honor him, but to use his legendary name as a shield to keep the other tribes from starting another revolution. The French military marched right into their sacred land, building heavy army bases and stripping away the freedom the Ayit Ata had just bled for. But you can't cage a mountain lion forever. Oobslam kept fighting their control from the shadows, refusing to bow to their empire. Because he never stopped resisting, the furious French authorities finally snapped. They arrested the mastermind and threw him into forced exile, kicking him out of his own homeland. For years, he was banished from his beloved Red Peaks. But guess what? France couldn't hold Morocco forever. In 1956, the chains finally broke, and Morocco won its independence. Oobslam made a legendary return, welcomed home by the king himself as a true national hero. He lived his final years seeing his people free until he passed away on August 16, 1960. France tried to break him. They tried to erase him. But in the end, Aso Oobslam's legacy outlived their entire empire.